Good evening, everyone. How are you? I'm David L. Ulin. I'm the books editor of Alta Journal, and welcome to this month's installment of Alta's California Book Club. Tonight, we will be discussing Héctor Tobar's novel, The Barbarian Nurseries. But before that, just a few opening program notes. For those of you who are new to the event and don't know the California Book Club or Alta, Alta is a quarterly journal on California arts and culture and history and life, West Coast culture and literature and life, with an active web presence, including weekly book reviews and other cultural and literary coverage. One of our functions here is the California Book Club, which was started a little over a year ago, where every month we gather and talk about a significant California book with the author. It's a kind of rare opportunity to go deep on what we might call the new California canon. And so we're delighted you're all here to join us tonight. I want to first thank our partners, Book Passage, Books Inc., Book Soup, Bookshop, Diesel, a bookstore, the Huntington USC Institute on California and the West, the Los Angeles Public Library, the San Francisco Public Library, Narrative Magazine, Vroman's Bookstore, and Zizova. And I want to also remind you that we have a sale for California Book Club members for just $50. You'll get a year of Alta Journal. You'll get the CBC book tote bag, which is this handsome fellow right here, which I know I'm an aficionado of tote bags, but this is a really good one. Zippers and Velcro, as I've said before, and lots of space for all of your books. And you'll also receive one of the upcoming California Book Club titles. Watch tomorrow's thank you email for a link to this deal. Also, I want to remind everyone to visit the California Book Club Clubhouse after the event tonight to keep the conversation going. This is a space for California Book Club members to dig even deeper into the Barbarian Nurseries, share questions, discuss tonight's event, and also to discuss upcoming California Book Club books. You'll find links to sign up for the Clubhouse in the comments section and in tomorrow's email. So now I'd like to turn this over to my colleague, John Freeman, who's the host of the California Book Club, who will be interviewing tonight's guest, Héctor Tobar. John, welcome to tonight's book club show.
Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. Happy almost holidays, or happy holidays if they've started for you. What a year, what a long year. It's been such a journey for us to have you along on this quest to remap the literary landscape of California with these amazing 12 points of light that we've chosen in the last year. And I think in the grips of all kinds of rather sometimes frustrating dialogues happening in the public space, this one hopefully is a comforting one, and in the sense that I believe that there's a restorative complexity that emerges in great storytelling and in great works of poetry and art, that we can step into our fullest selves when we're with these books and talking to the authors. And so not only is this a literary errand to celebrate the best of the new writing coming from and about California, it's one of the spirit, I hope. It's one of civic space. And given the kind of state that California is, it also means that we're talking about the dream. We have to kind of re-verify the supposed dream being dreamed and re-dream the supposedly verified about California. And these books have really made that possible. And I don't think a writer on this list, though, exemplifies the ability of storytelling and observing and telling people's stories quite so well as Héctor Tobar. Many of you, and if you're dialing in from Los Angeles, might know you as him as a former LA Weekly reporter, a LA Times journalist who won his Pulitzer covering the LA uprising in 1992. Also a overseas bureau chief in Mexico City. He also reported from Argentina. But he's been observing and telling stories. He's been bringing the lives of Latinx people into books for over 20 years now. I first came across his work when I read this extraordinary book, Translation Nation, which is kind of a Latinx journey a la de Tocqueville around the United States, stopping in communities where Latinx people are living, from Nebraska to Idaho, down through the deep South. Hector talks to them and tells their stories with the immense compassion and sympathy that are his trademarks, never guiding, always just simply listening. And that's been a hallmark of Hector's work over the years, his ability to tell stories on the behalf of others, to be the storyteller. It's something that he talked about when he went to Guatemala for the first time in his 20s and realized that suddenly, he writes about this in Alta, he was the storyteller. And in his first novel, The Tattooed Soldier, he tells the story of a man haunted by the violence that he left behind in Guatemala and its dictatorship, which claimed the lives of his family, suddenly comes across the man who took those lives in Los Angeles. It's an extraordinary book, and if you've loved this one, I recommend going back to it. When the 33 Chilean miners who were trapped and ultimately saved and rescued in decided to work together to have their story told, they turned to Hector to tell that story for reasons that will be obvious tonight. And I think there's something at work in a similar way with Barbarian Nurseries, this extraordinary book we're here to talk about, this sort of California epic, a kind of rewriting of the suburban novel, a story of a house divided. Scott and Maureen Torres-Thompson, a couple, Scott being the son of a first generation Mexican immigrant to Los Angeles, is drifting away from his roots. He's overly stretched financially. Maureen is feeling somehow like she hasn't really done enough to make the household that they're living in up in the hills in Orange County in a gated community. They've had to lay off 2/3 of the people that work at their house, all of them undocumented, leaving Araceli, the heart of this novel, who Hector, in the most amazing 19th century way, comes in and brings to life. I think that's a great place to start, because I haven't come across a character quite like her and with her depth in the 10 years since this book came out. And it's such a pleasure to be with him tonight, to celebrate her, and also later to be talking with his good friend Reina Grande as well. Hector.
I am unable. Okay, there we go. Start my video.
Welcome.
Hello. Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for that wonderful introduction, John. And thank you to everyone at Alta and to David and Reina for being here. I love all of you and your work at Alta Magazine. And thank you so much for making me part of this monthly party that you have. I'm just I'm so gratified to be here.
Well, your book came up immediately once we started meeting. And I should say that these books are all chosen by a kind of panel of California fans of California literature, including Oscar Villalone and Danzy Senna, Marisa Lopez, Paul Yamazaki, Linnell George, and David, of course. And we had a hard time choosing because we were fans of all of your books, including your latest, The Last Great Road Bum. But there's something special about this book. It feels like it captures not just a time and a mythic division of labor within a household, but it feels like you really are sort of shooting for the fences in scale. You know, it begins almost right. Shakespearean. There's references to the house divided. You in the first opening segment, you very delicately and deftly move through about 8 points of view, but we gradually land on Araceli as the heart. Did you think I am going to write the California epic, but I'm going to set it in the suburbs? Well, what was your goal?
Yeah, I have to confess to those grandiose dreams. Absolutely. I wanted to write a really big California novel and set it in a very intimate space, the intimate space of a home. And, you know, it's funny you mentioned Shakespeare because, you know, I had a very poor Southern California public education. So I had never really read or been taught, Shakespeare's oeuvre the way that my kids, for example, are learning it today, in our times. But back in the 1970s and 80s in California, Southern California schools, I had not really read Shakespeare. And so when I was writing the Barbarian Nurseries, I was reading most of Shakespeare's oeuvre for the first time. And that's why there's so much Shakespeare thrown in there. Because it was just like, it's like having your first kiss when you're 30 or something, that just discovering something that's so rich and so, life affirming. And so, yeah, I wanted to tell a story, the story of Los Angeles. And also, this was a novel set against the anti-immigrant movement. And I remember starting to write it at about the time that the first protests were taking place against Proposition 187, which you'll remember was this initiative that eventually passed to deny services to undocumented immigrants in the state of California, including hospital services, including public schools. And so I was just very angry, especially when I sat to write down my first draft. And then, I wanted to tell a story of the hugeness of the city that I had seen as a reporter. I'm a kid from a few different LA neighborhoods, including South Whittier, like Scott Torres. I was raised in South Whittier. I'm also from East Hollywood and Montebello. And I had, become a reporter. And as a reporter for the LA Times or the Metro section, I got to see all different kinds of life of the city. I'd go to Beverly Hills for political fundraisers. I'd go to the criminal courts and the jails. I'd be present at drive-by shootings. I'd go to South Central Los Angeles, some of the poorest neighborhoods in the city. I covered homelessness. And so that sort of sense of the panorama and scope of the city is what I was trying to capture in the Barbarian Nurseries.
And all those elements are present in this book, and actually in the house itself. I mean, there's two things at work here, which is all of the elements that you're describing about Los Angeles work laterally across the book, as it moves across the city, but also within the house, given who comes to service the house and its needs, and who's working within the house. Aside from homelessness, these factors are all there, and I find your ability to do both at the same time really, really impressive. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about that, because typically with a novel, there's scope and then there's domestic. Right. And you're kind of doing both. And I wonder what you're saying in that juxtaposition.
Well, I was trying to teach myself to do both. I feel the scope, the sort of panorama of the city was something that came natural to me. What didn't come natural was writing about family. So at about the same time I was reading Shakespeare, I was reading Chekhov, and I was reading Alice Munro. I was reading Cheever, John Cheever. I was reading all of the sort of, masters of domestic spaces in fiction to teach myself how to do that. And I was greatly aided by the fact that as I was writing this book, my wife and I were raising our children, our first, second, and third children. So the book has 3 children because my family has 3 children. My children are all sort of grown up now. But 2 sons and a daughter, that was my household. And not only that, I was really aided by the fact that, I have family who've worked as domestics. I have a late aunt. My mother briefly worked cleaning houses. So I know what it's like to be sort of the small outsider in the larger sort of white, upper middle class space. But also, for a time I lived in Latin America. You mentioned I was a foreign correspondent. And my wife and I lived in a house with servants, with multiple servants. We even had a driver. I didn't give Scott and Maureen a driver, but we had, when we lived in Buenos Aires, we had a driver who, somebody we could call up and he would take us anywhere we wanted to go. And so I lived both that other side, that side of comfort and being pampered. And, when Araceli sees the boys' bedroom and sees all the wonders in it, that's me seeing my children's bedroom when we lived in Buenos Aires or Mexico City, all the things in it, and thinking of it as the room of 1,000 wonders, el cuarto de las mil maravillas. So, I really tried very, very hard to create this sense of domesticity and to work at creating the textures of it, the everyday feel of the cycles of work in a household in which there's hired help.
And it begins with mowing the lawn. I wonder if you can give us a little taste from the opening pages.
Oh, sure. Yes, this is, this is the opening to the novel. And it came to me about that time that these, demonstrations were taking place against Proposition 187. Way back in the early 90s is when I first wrote the first pages of what later would become the Barbarian Nurseries many years later. And so I imagined, if they kicked all the Mexicans out, what would it be like for someone, an upper middle class person, to cut his own grass? So I will read this. Scott Torres was upset because the lawnmower wouldn't start, because no matter how hard he pulled at the cord, it didn't begin to roar. His exertions produced only a brief flutter of the engine, like the cough of a sick child, and then an extended silence filled by the buzzing of two dragonflies doing figure eights over the uncut St. Augustine grass. The lawn was precocious, ambitious, 8 inches tall, and for the moment it could entertain jungle dreams of one day shading the house from the sun. The blades would rise as long as he pulled at the cord and the lawnmower coughed. He gripped the cord's plastic handle, paused and leaned forward to gather breath and momentum, and tried again. The lawnmower roared for an instant, spit a clump of grass from its jutting black mouth, and stopped. Scott stepped back from the machine and gave it the angry everyman stare of fatherliness frustrated, of a handyman being unhandy. Araceli, his Mexican maid, watched him from the kitchen window, her hands covered with a white bubble skin of dishwater. She wondered if she should tell El Señor Scott the secret that made the lawnmower roar. When you turned a knob on the side of the engine, it made starting the machine as easy as pulling a loose thread from a sweater. She had seen Pepe play with this knob several times, but no, she decided to let El Señor Scott figure it out himself. Scott Torres had let Pepe and his chunky gardener's muscles go. She would allow this struggle with the machine to be her boss's punishment. El Señor Scott opened the little cap on the mower where the gas goes in just to check. Yes, it has gas. Araceli had seen Pepe fill it up that last time he was here, on that Thursday 2 weeks ago, when she almost wanted to cry because she knew she would never see him again. Pepe never had any problems getting the lawnmower started. When he reached down to pull the cord, it caused his bicep to escape his sleeve, revealing a mass of taut copper skin that hinted at other patches of skin and muscle beneath the old cotton shirts he wore. Araceli thought there was art in the stains on Pepe's shirts. They were an abstract, expressionist whirlwind of greens, clayish ochre, and blacks made by grass, soil, and sweat. A handful of times, she had rather boldly brought her lonely fingertips to these canvases. When Pepe arrived on Thursdays, Araceli would open the curtains in the living room and spray and wipe the squeaky clean windows just so she could watch him sweat over the lawn and imagine herself nestled in the protective cinnamon cradle of his skin. And then she would laugh at herself for doing so. I'm still a girl with silly daydreams. Pepe's disorderly masculinity broke the spell of working and living in the house. And when she saw him in the frame of the kitchen window, she could imagine living in the world outside, in a home with dishes of her own to wash, a desk of her own to polish and fret over, in a room that wasn't borrowed from someone else. Araceli enjoyed her solitude, her apartness from the world, and she liked to think of working for the Torres-Thompson family as a kind of self-imposed exile from her previous directionless life in Mexico City. But every now and then she wanted to share the pleasures of this solitude with someone and step outside her silent California existence into one of her alternative daydream lives. She might be a mid-level Mexican government functionary, one of those tough, big women with a mean sense of humor and a leonine, rust-tinted coiffure, ruling a little fiefdom in a Mexico City neighborhood. Or she might be a successful artist, or maybe an art critic. Pepe figured in many of her fantasies as the quiet and patient father of their children, who had chic Aztec names such as Cuitláhuac and Xochitl. In these extended daydreams, Pepe was a landscape architect, a sculptor, and Araceli herself was 10 kilos thinner, about the weight she had been before coming to the United States, because her years in California had not been kind to her wasteland. All of her Pepe reveries were over now. They were preposterous, but they were hers, and their sudden absence felt like a kind of theft. Instead of Pepe, she had El Señor Scott to look at, wrestling with the lawnmower and the cord that made it start. At last, Scott discovered the little knob. He began to make adjustments, and he pulled at it again. His arms were thin and oatmeal colored. He was what they called here half Mexican. And after 20 minutes in the June sun, his forearms, forehead, and cheeks were the glowing crimson of Macintosh apples. Once, twice, a third time, as Señor Scott pulled at the cord, turning the knob a little more each time until the engine began to kick, sputter, and roar. Soon the air was green with flying grass, and Araceli watched the corner of her boss's lips rise in quiet satisfaction. Then the engine stopped, the sound muffled in an instant because the blade had choked on too much lawn. So that's the opening to my novel, The Barbarian Nurseries. Thank you.
I'm so happy to hear you read that section, because we get to hear from the very beginning the extraordinary richness of Araceli's point of view. And she grew up in Mexico City, as you sort of hint there, and she studied to be an artist, like you did, going to UC Santa Cruz and Irvine. But you've written and talked about previously that your own father had artistic sentiments, and I wonder what happens or why you put these into her body and her mind, and what that does to the book right now, and also when you were writing it.
Well, yeah, she is my alter ego. Araceli is me. She is an intellectual trapped in the body of a servant. And that's the way I felt growing up. I think that's the way I felt until the Barbarian Nurseries came out and was translated into French. And then I went to Paris, and when I had the Parisian literary journalistic establishment asking questions about this novel, I realized maybe I really am an artist, because I had grown up in a family where being an artist, being a writer wasn't a career path that I never remotely imagined I would become a writer, even though it was clear from an early age I wrote well. And so, so Araceli is that creation. It's my, my desire. She is expressing my desire to be taken seriously as a writer, as an artist. This whole book is an effort, is many, many years of effort of me trying to become a respected literary writer in my own head, trying to teach myself how a domestic, how a citywide novel should be written. And so very much I every page was a battle to elevate the prose. That opening I read, I can't remember how many drafts of that I wrote. I must have written 10, 15, 20 drafts, tinkering it with over and over again, tinkering with it. And so there is a lot of hunger there. There's hunger to be taken seriously, hunger to reach as high as I can reach, with the descriptions, giving myself all sorts of challenges. I remember when I started writing the novel, I thought I'm going to have like 100 Latino characters in this. I'm going to need 100 synonyms for brown. I want to just say brown skin. And so I went through cinnamon, mocha, copper, I went through them all, and I eventually started to use phrases, make up phrases for brown. So yeah, there's a lot of me as an Araceli.
Yeah, there's a lot of compound nouns and adjectives about, when I was reading, I thought of Jorge Amado, who has the Museum of the Portuguese Language in Brazil once had an exhibit of his work, and they had on one wall every description of brown skin he had used, and it covered the wall. It was utterly beautiful. And I'm glad you brought up French, because when I was rereading it this time, I couldn't help but think of the 19th century French novelists who were sort of working in a time when the novel brought the news to some degree. Zola in particular, writing about coal mining strikes and the life of the life of the city, in a way, was brought to life in fiction and novels. And I wonder what you think about that as a novelist, because
Yeah.
you're not, while you're also, working on the level of high art, you're also in a very old-fashioned but wonderfully contemporary way bringing the news. And of course, if you are bringing the news in reaction to the, I grew up in California in the 90s too, so I remember the hideousness of the Prop 187 debates. If you're reacting to idiocy, then you have to suddenly do very basic things like prove someone like Araceli is a human.
Right.
And so I wonder how you balance that desire to bring the news, reach high art, and not react to something that causes you to prove
Right.
a very basic truth, which is that, Mexican people are human too.
Right. Well, you mentioned the French novelists, and you mentioned this idea of the novel bringing the news. And you have to remember, that's my origin as a writer. I was a newspaper reporter. And so as a newspaper reporter, I would remember, going around the city, and I would be going to parts of the city that no one else went to unless they lived there. And so that idea of being a witness and being a correspondent, even within a city itself, is to me very, very much the way I grew up as a writer. And I sort of still feel that way. That I am part of the joy of reading a work of fiction or a work of nonfiction is this idea that the writer has borne witness to something. And so, yeah, that definitely, informed a big part of what I was doing, all the scenes in the novel, driving of the city, the train ride past the homeless camps, South Central Los Angeles, the garment district, all those places that Araceli visits, the jail. I went to the LA County jail more than once as a reporter. And, the sort of maze that I describe is the maze that's in the, that is in the jail. The courthouses, seeing undocumented people go, get deported from the jail. All those things are things that I witnessed. Now, the other part of it, though, yes, I think that it's one of the more difficult parts of writing this kind of novel is that you can very easily become very, very polemical, and very argumentative. And in fact, the first draft I wrote of this novel was read by my first agent, the late, great Virginia Barber. And she told me, Hector, this is too polemical. And it was. I had written it before I had family. And so part of my task in rewriting what would eventually become the Barbarian Nurseries was to make it more real, to make it more about a family, to render that family in multi dimensions. And so, yeah, that is really, I always felt that tension because it's just a big danger that this kind of social novel can become very didactic.
If you've read the novel, after that wonderful opening, there's a kind of amazing, almost rolling dolly shot of a birthday party that takes place at the Torres-Thompson house.
Right.
Which stretches almost as long as the deer hunter opening wedding scene with all the great detail. And you see it from Araceli's perspective, Maureen's perspective, Scott's perspective, the guest's perspective. And then there's a kind of rupture within the family, and Scott goes off and does something he has to later apologize for, and Maureen leaves, and Araceli is left with the children, and what she has to figure out what to do is very little. She has a photograph of Scott's grandfather, who may or may not be alive, but lived on 39th Street. She has the two kids, the two boys with her. Maureen is left with the infant. And so she takes these kids on a cross-town journey across LA. And the person who will know the most about this journey, other than you, is Reina Grande, who's here with us. She grew up and spent time she didn't grow up, but she spent time in South Whittier. She spent time in South Central. She knows many of the spots that you're writing about. And also, given what she's written about in her amazing memoir, The Distance Between Us, which we talked about earlier this year when she was a guest, she knows the journey that Araceli has undergone because her family did it and she did it. She also, by the way, has a new novel coming out called A Ballad of Love and Glory, which is
Great book.
truly gorgeous. Reina, could you come on and talk to Hector for a bit?
Yay, Reina Grande, hooray.
Hi.
There you are. I mean, there's your voice.
Yeah, there's my, I was trying. Oh,
Yeah,
there you go.
They're going to turn it on.
Yeah,
for you,
the
though.
video is hard to turn on. Hello, Hector.
Hola, Reina, ¿qué tal?
Good to see you. This is so exciting to get to hear you talk more about your novel. And I just want to say what an honor it was to write the foreword for this 10th anniversary edition. I couldn't believe when I got your email asking me if I would do it. I was like, wow, me? So thank you so much for that. I really enjoyed being able to, I enjoyed it the first time I read it, all those years ago when it came out, and then I really enjoyed reading it again and just being able to sit with it a lot longer, you know, and think about what I was going to say about the book. And I had questions while I was reading it that I really wanted to ask you, and now I'm so glad I get to do that. So some questions I had, basically, you know, there's of course that question about immigration, about how things have not changed a whole lot since you wrote the book, and it's so heartbreaking, you know, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, you know, that those conflicting feelings, right? Because when you wrote the book, you hoped that your book would lead to at least a little bit of change or inspire us to self-reflect about what kind of country we wanted to be and try to make some changes. And yet here we are, and we're still a divided nation.
Yeah, you know, it would be really hard for me to write the Barbarian Nurseries today because I really had a very lighthearted spirit in that novel, you know. Araceli's indocumentada, you know, but she rolls with it in a way, you know, she's very angry and but at the same time sort of carefree in her own way. And I sort of had imagined back then that very quickly my novel would become dated, that it would be like a relic from the American past, and that, you know, Araceli would, the Aracelis of the world would get their you know, their status, get their green cards and go on to become US citizens, unknowing that this was going to drag on for another, you know, 10 years longer. And it looks like it might drag on for another even 10 years more, where, you know, the people who were, you know, young adults when I wrote my novel, undocumented young adults, are now approaching middle age, you know, and so that's very, very hurtful. But it just feels also more relevant than ever, you know, because the novel really isn't just about Araceli being undocumented. It's about class, you know, social class in Los Angeles, in California, and how we construct these identities, this idea of the difference of peoples, of undocumented and documented, legal, illegal, whatever, to justify these inequalities. And my novel really attempted to be a portrait of a city, you know, that was stratified, all the different sort of, you know, there's many, many different kinds of Latino or Latinx identity in this novel, many different kinds of Latino people. There's, you know, I have a Latino intellectual blogger in there who kind of makes fun of the Latino intellectual class. And so, you know, it's wonderful what's happened in the last 10 years in terms of, I think Latino people are much more part of the civic discussion in California than they were back, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago when I first started writing the novel. But it's also really troubling how long this is dragged out, and how there are people who have lived, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40 years as undocumented people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there's something to be said too about the Latino writer, right? I mean, there's been some really great things happening in literature and in the writing community that have benefited Latino writers, but not a lot has changed also since 10 years ago when this book came out, in terms of, you know, what opportunities do Latino writers have?
Right. Yeah, I think my books have always been an attempt to expand the idea of what Latino writers can do. Like my last novel, my most recent novel, The Last Great Road Bum, it's about a white guy, and it's about a Midwestern family in addition to being about the Salvadoran Civil War. And so, I took on something that not a lot of Latino writers feel that they would have quote unquote permission to do.
Mhm.
And I know a lot of young Latino writers get advice that tells them, they get this advice from agents, from people, at writers' conferences, in classrooms, telling them to write a certain kind of story, focus on a certain kind of story. And I've always tried to blow up the idea of what we can do. And of course, Reina, you just did this in your last novel, your novel that's coming out, which I had great honor to read. Has Irish immigrants in it. And you did an incredible job of reconstructing this Irish US identity, the identity of these immigrants, and all the work you did, the research you did to reconstruct their Irishness I was so blown away by that. And that's what I tried to do in the Barbarian Nurseries, was to say, look, I cannot just create Latino characters. I'm going to create this, the Maureen is from Missouri, there's African-American characters in the novel. There is a Korean woman character in the novel briefly. And so, and the novel really is very political. Underneath this domestic story, there's a lot of strong political messages. And so, I've always seen myself as someone trying to stretch the boundaries of what we're supposed to do as Latino writers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that was also something that I enjoyed in the book, is that you ventured out into writing from a female perspective. So that can be tricky. And I know, like, having written this novel of, that has a male protagonist, I kind of struggle with that, like trying to capture what the world looks like from a male perspective. So what was it like for you when you switched and you were writing from a female perspective?
Well, I was very careful. And, part of it is that, like you, I went to UC Santa Cruz. And I remember when I showed up as a 17-year-old from, Eastern LA County at UC Santa Cruz with my sort of like ideas of what, men and women's roles were in society, that I had the feminists of UC Santa Cruz kick my ass and explain to me the way the world really worked. And so I think that really taught me something very important, which was to recognize my blind spots. And so with Araceli, I'd ask myself again and again, what am I not seeing? Like I said before, I was helped a lot by the fact that we had many women working in our house. And when we lived in Mexico, especially, I would have conversations, and my wife and I, we would get to know these women very, very well. Sometimes we went out to their villages in the, outskirts of Mexico City. And I remember also I met a very tall Mexicana once when I was working in Mexico City, and I asked her, what's it like to be tall, tall Mexicana, And I forgot what she told me, but I did incorporate, sort of that notion of Araceli being sort of like this tall, lumbering kind of person.
Yeah.
So I worked really hard at it. I observed a lot, I observed, especially observing in my own household, as I said before, just the way my wife would cooperate with my wife, Virginia Espino, who's I know watching this call, the way she would work with the women who worked in our house, and the way they would develop the sort of symbiosis with each other when they worked well together. All of that, it was very, this is partly why it took me, almost 10, 15 years to finish this novel.
Wow. Well, when you remember what she told you about what it's like to be a tall Mexican woman, let me know, because I'm 5 feet tall, so I'll never know what it's like to be a tall Mexican woman.
Right.
Okay, so my last question before I give the floor back to John is, I am really fascinated by the fact that, as a journalist, as a reporter, you're also able to write fiction, because that doesn't happen all the time with journalists. I think they struggle to switch, because with journalism, in journalism school, they always tell you, you are not the story. Right. And also in terms of structure, you have to write your articles where you put all the important information at the beginning in
Right.
case your article gets cut at the end. So with a novel, it's the opposite, because the novel has to have a lot of build up, and you're leading to the climax. And then also in the novel, you have to be able to embody those characters. So I'm really fascinated by your ability to do both, you know, to be a journalist and to be a novelist. So what has been challenging for you switching, and how has it helped you to be a journalist, and in what ways has it hurt your fiction to be a journalist?
Yeah, I think journalism really helped me a lot as a fiction writer because it took me outside of my world. And it put me in all these situations where I had to observe other people. And it taught me a basic lesson, which is the lesson of the surprise of the real, right? So when you're a reporter and you go out to a homeless camp, you know, you go out to a home in Beverly Hills or whatever, something's going to surprise you. And that's what you pass on to the reader, that sense of surprise. And so I incorporated that into my fiction, the sense of like the awe, the sense of wonder of going to a new place is something that, you know, I constantly rely on that because I know that's what engages the reader. The hard part is that in journalism, you know, journalism is daily newspaper writing is very anti-intellectual. It's anti-metaphor, it's anti-symbolism. So when you try to use that in daily journalism, very often, you know, I would get made fun of by my editors or whatever, or they would, you know, resist my language. But I mean, I have to say that becoming a novelist helped my journalism tremendously because I learned to write about ambiguity, you know, situations that were not clear cut. I learned to write, you know, create more textured worlds and to observe more as a nonfiction writer. It helped me tremendously when I wrote this Chilean miners book because I had learned to think like a novelist. And so I interview people like a novelist. You know, I want to know the whole person, not just the person who's the survivor, not just the person who has some sort of fact to tell me. I want to know the whole person when I interview somebody. And that is something that I learned from being a novelist.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Hector.
Thank you,
I'm
Reina.
so glad to be here and to listen to you, and I'm learning so much from you and from your work.
Thank you, and congratulations on the new book coming up.
Thank you.
Whoops, you're silent there, John. You've muted
right.
yourself. Okay, there you go.
I've made my window extremely small. I'm about the size of a thumbnail, but it was really great to hear the two of you talk because of the way that your work is connected. And as we've been talking, a lot of people have been picking up on the metaphor within the title of the book, The Barbarian Nurseries, because on top of everything else that Hector is doing that we've already talked about in this book, there's also an ecology within the book as a metaphor, you know, of a transplanted garden being ripped up and replanted. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about why you chose the title and what it means as the book evolves.
Yeah, you know, the title is a play on the two senses of the word nursery, right? A nursery is a place where you raise children or where you raise plants, right? And in Los Angeles, in Southern California, both of those jobs, the tending of gardens and the raising of children, both of those jobs very often involve Latino immigrants. And what is the dominant image of the Latino immigrant, let's say in cable news, you know, when I was writing the novel? Well, is of the barbarous immigrant, the person who is uneducated or violent, right? This sort of poor, dumb peasant who has to work, you know, in these, you know, these hard labor jobs, or the person who is dangerous, you know. And so it's the barbarian, you know, the Barbarian Nurseries means the barbarians who raise our children and the barbarians who tend to our gardens and plants, and in the American imagination that they are barbarous people.
As the book progresses and Araceli works her way across town, of course, I don't think it gives too much away to say that the absence of the two boys is noted and then becomes a story in and of itself that kind of runs out of control. And I think as a journalist, you must have seen this kind of thing all the time, if not specifically about a non-abduction called an abduction.
Right.
Tropes that are deployed in news stories that must have just set your teeth on edge. I wonder if you can read a bit from that section of the book, as the story kind of runs away from the reality of what's actually happening, which is that Araceli is really simply trying to, keep these boys safe.
Right. So the passage here, that's the case was a troubling mystery. That passage that you're the
Yes.
the third one you had mentioned before. So this becomes a subject. Araceli is missing with these three children, and then she's found, and it becomes, as I say here, the case was a troubling mystery, said the NBC television affiliate reporter, a portrait of gray-haired youthfulness, well known to Southern Californians for the calm urgency of his reporting on the edge of brush fires, mudslides, and assorted gangland crime scenes. We really don't know what shape those boys are in or what they went through. We don't know if this Mexican nanny will be charged with anything. We don't know what exactly her intentions were, the reporter said, summarizing all he didn't know when his affiliate patched him into the network's national cable feed. For several hours, the repeated transmissions of Araceli's blurred backyard photograph were juxtaposed with the footage of the searches and lines at the border, and of Araceli being tackled, and of the gleaming white home in a neighborhood most often described with the adjectives exclusive, hillside, and gated. As interest in the story deepened in the early Eastern Daylight Time evening on national cable news, the class of professional tragedy pundits chimed in. They were former prosecutors and defense attorneys who specialized in taking small bites of nebulous information and chewing on them until they became opinions and insights based on what my gut tells me. Some opined, why not, on what they believed they knew about Mexican women and the well-off families that could afford to place their children in the care of foreigners. These comments intermingled with those of faceless callers to nationwide toll-free lines, for whom Araceli grew into a figure of menace and dread, while Maureen and Scott became objects of pity splashed with a touch of envy and populist scorn. There's a good reason to stay at home and be a mom and not leave your kids with a Mexican girl, even if you can afford one for $10 a day, a caller opined in Gaithersburg, Maryland, speaking to the women of the flaring nostrils, who nodded gravely. In those American homes where Mexican, Guatemalan, and Peruvian women actually worked, mothers and fathers digested the news and looked across their freshly dusted living rooms and tautly made beds and gave their hired help a closer look. They asked themselves questions that they usually suppressed because the answers were, in practice, unknowable. Where is this woman from, and how much do I really know about her? So, yes.
I love that the book is big, capacious enough to have all these different registers within it, so that you're even commenting on the sort of the potboiler nature of the story as it's reported. There's some questions been coming in from the audience, and I want to bring in a few of them. One of them is just several people have asked, Kathleen among them, if you've ever considered a sequel about Araceli, because I think there could be stories there.
You know, I haven't really thought of a sequel, mostly because I really like the ending, and I like the ambiguity of the ending, whether or not she goes to Mexico and stays in the United States. Whoops, I'm sort of giving away the ending. But I like the ending because it sort of captures something about being Latino in the US. But I have thought about giving her cameos in other novels that I'm writing. So Araceli might make a cameo in another novel I've written, but I haven't actually thought of a sequel yet. No.
The other thing I thought about rereading this book was just how how kind of opposite her journey is to some degree to the character in The Last Great Road Bum,
Oh,
who's an adventurer who leaves and travels by choice, who sort of inserts himself into history by force of will and desire and curiosity, whereas to some degree she travels by force of necessity, both to the United States and then also across town. And I wonder if you've ever thought about these journeys as kind of Janus faces to, not overly simplified, but a certain kind of American motion.
yeah. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I had not really thought of them that way, but I think that definitely they both are attempts to tell certain kinds of odysseys. The internal odyssey of the megalopolis of Los Angeles and all the worlds that it contains. And then Joe Sanderson in my most recent novel, The Last Great Road Bum, that just, the odyssey literally around the globe twice, literally talking his way into a war. I mean, Joe becomes a soldier in a war in El Salvador, fighting with the rebels. And I think it speaks to my own desire to be in all these different places and to be in these worlds. And just the wonder of being a writer and being able to imagine all these different worlds. And so, yeah, I had never really thought about that, but they are really definitely two sides of the same kind of desire.
I've had the good fortune to work with you a couple times on some nonfiction pieces, for most recently for an anthology about the protests and uprisings of last summer in the context of a kind of long liberationist movement within the United States, which is being pushed back against by a very anti-liberationist movement for how to define what a citizen is, who deserves care and safety. And one thing I was quite struck by your contribution in that is just the almost spiritual nature to the way you threw your voice up into the sky and looked down on what was happening. How would these protests look from the heavens almost? I mean, that's kind of one way I looked at the piece you wrote. And there's a similar aspect of grace that comes up in Deep Down Dark. And I wonder, as you go deeper into your writing career, if you come to face challenges not just of craft, of style, of voice, and your ability to imagine, but your ability to reckon with something that is on the scale of the spirit.
Yeah, I think that, this is, you get older, your kids grow up. When I started writing, trying to write fiction, none of my kids had been born yet, and now they're all readers themselves. Two of them are in their 20s. One is about to graduate high school. And I find myself thinking a lot about this spot of earth that I occupy, Southern California, and its place in the history of humanity. And where we're headed. And we're living in a really dark time in the United States. We're living in a time of these incredible divisions. I think both you and I, we grew up in times of great optimism. We lived this time of American growth and possibility. We saw the creation of a diverse country. We both have we have memories of the tail end of Jim Crow. And in my case, I can remember. I can remember the kind of discrimination that ordinary Mexican-American Latino people faced that they don't face so much anymore, right? Unless they're undocumented. And so to see that world now where we are, I mean, it is a very, it has placed me in a space of deep reflection. And history is always very, very important in my work. And as you get older, your sense of the depth of human experience through time really becomes this incredible palette for you as a writer. And so I'm in, as things get more troubled in this country, I think I enjoy being a writer more because I feel more relevant than ever. I feel like in fiction, in nonfiction, in these literary forms, we're able to touch on these questions of justice and injustice and of the soul in ways that other people can't in other forms.
And you mentioned history. I would like to bring Raina back on for one last question. I'm sure she has one in her pocket, just simply because her new novel, which is called A Ballad of Love and Glory, is coming out in March. It sort of borrows from a line from John Greenleaf Whittier's poem, in which he mentions a Mexican woman named Jimene. And I wonder, Raina, if you had a question for Hector about working in these times, and what you can take from, or what you search for in history, because I saw in the first half of the book of yours I've read that you're finding something that happened in the past, which maybe wasn't written about, maybe forgotten, and so you're restoring a sort of Mexican American element to history that perhaps was seen in a unilateral way.
Yeah, I think, well, for me, like writing the novel about the Mexican American War, it came from a place of anger, because I was angry that in California schools or schools across the country, we don't study the Mexican American War. Children don't grow up knowing anything about it. And as a Mexican immigrant, when I came to live in California, I was always made to feel like a foreigner, like an outsider. I was made to feel ashamed about my Mexican roots and my Spanish tongue. And it wasn't until I went to UC Santa Cruz that I learned about the Mexican American War. And I realized how much it would have helped me as a child, knowing that the state of California was once part of Mexico, and that Spanish was spoken here before English was spoken here. So because of that anger, I started to write this book. And I know, Hector, you talked about anger too. You mentioned earlier about how anger has also encouraged you and motivated you to write about some of these issues, like immigration, like class and all of these things that you write about. And you say that angry is such a powerful fuel for a writer, because you're able to channel it into and turn it into something positive.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, Raina, writing a novel is such a slow process, and it's 99% done in solitude, And so it takes a certain kind of self-belief and motivation to sit down in front of the keyboard, every morning or every evening, depending on which kind of writer you are, and just to keep on doing it. And so to me, that's where the anger comes in, is the anger comes when I sit, just to get myself going in the morning, the anger, the frustration, sometimes my own sense of inadequacy before all these sort of different kinds of discrimination. But what you have to do when you become an artist, when you become a writer, is to turn that inside out, as you do in your work, when you, for example, in your wonderful book, The Distance Between Us, what you do with your father. Your father is someone who inflicted traumas on you, and yet you enter his point of view. You make him into this full human being. And so in my work lately, I write very often about people who are, evil, people who have done horrible things. And my idea is to enter into the kind of thinking that creates that person, right? Like in The Tattooed Soldier, my novel, which is about a killer. How do I get inside the small person's head, the small person who becomes a killer? And that's the real wonderful justification of the whole genre as an art form, is that you end up turning things inside out and revealing truths that we don't see if we always see things in black and white. So, absolutely.
There's a call from the audience that someone would like you to be their therapist, Hector.
Well, I was like a therapist when I wrote this book on the Chilean miners, except that I was a therapist who got all these guys to reveal their secrets, and then I told them all the stories of their secrets in a book. So I'm not the kind of therapist a writer is not the kind of therapist you want to have. A therapist is gonna tell the world what you shared with them. But
Yeah.
but thank you for saying that. I have been through therapy, so I
Yeah.
can appreciate that.
Have you thought?
I have a friend who's a therapist during the day, and she's a writer at night. And she told me that that's where she gets all her ideas for her novels, is from, from her clients, her patients.
Oh, and there have been therapists. Amy Bloom is a wonderful, short story writer and therapist too. So there are many people who've done that leap back and forth between those two professions.
Have you ever thought, Hector, of writing a memoir? Raina's written one that I think has changed the form of memoir in California that can be possibly written, and
Yeah,
no
absolutely.
doubt has given birth to many others. And I'm curious if you ever thought about writing one, or if you would shape it differently.
I think that there have been bits of memoir in all of my works. All of my works have little bits of me. And I now just finished a nonfiction project, just sent it off to my agent, a few weeks ago, which is a nonfiction book that has many elements of memoir in it. I think that what I've learned when I've let little bits of myself out there is the effect it can have on my family. My my relationship with my father has not quite recovered from the last New Yorker piece that I did, in which I talked about his young adulthood in California and some of the things that caused my parents to be divorced. And so, it's, I have thought about it, but I think that I probably will end my career never writing a memoir per se. Instead, just treating my life, the episodes of my life, like a garage sale or a swap meet. I've taken little bits and pieces here and there and put them in. And so my new book, which will probably come out in a couple of years, does have a little bit more scenes from here and there of my life, but not a full-fledged memoir.
Do you support that, Raina?
Well, yes and no. But I do think there's a lot of fear when you write memoir because of that, because of how it's going to impact your family.
Right.
And that's also one reason why I wrote novels before I even wrote the memoir, but was because I wanted to write about my experiences, but without exposing myself or my family and making myself so vulnerable on the page. So I hear what you're saying and I understand where you're coming from. And I think for now, if you're able to still write about yourself, but in your fiction, and if that fulfills you, then I say, yeah, go for it. And maybe, who knows, maybe 10 years from now, you might change your mind.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of little bits and pieces, Scott Torres, who's cutting the lawn at the beginning of the novel, is from South Whittier, like I was from South Whittier. And Scott Torres cutting the lawn, well, that was my job when I was growing up in the suburbs, was I had to cut the lawn. That was my chore. And I was the guy who had trouble getting the lawnmower started. So there's tons of stuff like that in my novels. And, there's a little boy who reads too much in the Barbarian Nurseries. And that was inspired a lot by Don Quixote, because I was reading Don Quixote also as I was writing the Barbarian Nurseries. And that little boy is a composite of my two boys, of Diego and Dante. Diego, big imagination, Dante, big reader. And so, yeah, there's a lot of elements in there that I've taken from my own family life.
Susan Berg wants to know if you would change anything if you wrote the book today.
The one thing where I felt, the one thing that I think is of the prosecutor, Ian Goller in the novel, and I think I would really spend more time with him, and I think I know that kind of person really well now. I even better now. And the funny thing is, I've had lawyers come up to me and tell me, yeah, that I know, I met people like that. I met DAs like that. But I really think I would spend a little bit more time with him. And so that I think I might change that. There's some parts too that to me feel, rereading them, 10, 15 years later, because I wrote a lot of the novel a long time ago. I'm surprised by how satirical I was. It's like I'd be laughing out loud at something that I wrote, and I'm thinking, oh my God, how could you do that? How could I do that? How could I be so satirical? And I'm also proud of myself for getting away with it. But yeah, so I don't, there's a lot of little things I would change, because that's the thing. I remember Garcia Marquez saying this. They asked him, when is a novel done? And he said, never. That there were things in 100 Years of Solitude that he wanted to change. The book was in galleys, and finally his publisher told him, stop, no, it's over, it's done. So all of my books are books that I could continue to revise, and I could definitely continue to revise the Barbarian Nurseries as much as anyone.
Well, one final question. The three of us are all products of California public schools.
Yes.
Different places. And one of the things that makes me enormously happy is knowing that the distance between us and Barbarian Nurseries or Translation Nation are being taught now in high schools. And I'm sure both of you have been to those programs as they've been teaching your book. And I wonder if you had anything that you could tell us about what that experience is like, or what kind of things that the students bring to you that either trouble you or give you hope or just have delighted you.
Reina, why don't you?
Yeah, well, I think for me, I feel so honored to be able to come into these high schools or middle schools or sometimes even elementary schools, because I was in my 20s when I met my first writer in person. And I remember when I saw her, Jeannie Wakatsuki Houston in person, and I said, oh my God, she's real. That means my dream is real too. And it was so empowering. So being able to come into these schools and meet, the students and the high schoolers, the middle schoolers, the little sixth graders, I just want to be there and tell them, yes, your dreams are real. They can't be real. You got to hold on to them. You got to fight for them. So that's something that I come in with, that, positive attitude. And I just want the kids to fully embrace their dreams, their goals, and to really fight to become the people that they're meant to be.
Yeah, it's wonderful to create that image for someone of what they can do. And I feel that almost every day, not just when I publish a book, but when I teach, when I'm in front of I teach at University of California, Irvine, and just seeing these future thinkers, or these people beginning their careers as thinkers, that to me is so gratifying to be able to share a little bit of my own, journey as a thinker, as a writer. I've had several times when I've met someone who told me, your book saved my life, which kind of blows me away, especially the Tattooed Soldier, because the Tattooed Soldier is taught so much in universities and community colleges. And it's a really angry and violent book. And I think that's why a lot of young readers really like it. And so just meeting them, and this idea that something that I worked on for so long in my solitude could actually help somebody, is a wonderful experience. And also that you've created a kind of pathway for people to enjoy the rest of literature, right? Because Reina, I know you've had this experience of people, it might be the first book that they finished reading in English, a whole first book that they finished is your book. I know that I met a young man once at Pasadena City College who gave my book to his father, a Salvadoran immigrant. And it was the first book his father had ever read in English. And he told his son, now you know what I went through. And that to me, I was weeping when he told me that, because it was such an affirmation of the craft of being a writer, right? Of taking emotions and ideas and facts and making them into a work of art that people can enjoy, and how liberating that can be, and that can show people like possibilities. And like you, I did not meet a writer until I had graduated from college. I was already in my mid-20s when I've met my first writer in person, and just to be that person and to be able to show somebody those possibilities, it's just a wonderful gift. Absolutely.
Well, you've done it again tonight, and it's been such an honor to have you here, Hector, and to celebrate and talk about Barbarian Nurseries. And Raina, congratulations on A Ballad of Love and Glory coming in March.
Thank you.
It's such a pleasure to have you back, and it was a pleasure to have you on the first time. It's a wonderful way to end the year of the book club with you. David, I think you're still here, so I think we need you to come back and give us our outro, but thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Hector. Thanks, Raina. That was a remarkable conversation, and I agree entirely. What a great way to close out the year of California Book Club. This interview was recorded and will be available at californiabookclub.com. Next month, on Thursday, January 20th, the book club selection will be Sarah Shunlin Bynum's story collection, Likes. Again, I want to remind everybody of the sale on Alta membership for California Book Club members at altaonline.com/tote. And please, if you're willing, participate in a 2-minute survey that will pop up as soon as we end the event. Stay safe, wear a mask. See you next month. Happy holidays. Take care, everybody. Have a good night.